Good afternoon. Hello, hello. Thank y'all very much for being here. This is a great crowd. Thank you to the Faculty Speakers Committee for their support. Thank you to the Novel Neighbor. They've got books out there for sale. Some of y'all have already seen that. Thank you deeply and abidingly to our donors who help us do what we do here. So thank you. Oh, and if you'd like to be a donor, you can come and see me after, or you can find one of these guys floating around. Got the little squeaky box on there. You can shoot. So listen, we in the English department love our alums, right? We love it when our alums come back to celebrate an accomplishment, or when they come just to hang out, or when they need help. We love to be able to help them. We're conscious of how much our alums help us, right? And we're very grateful to them, and we love seeing them. And of course, you know, whenever we have an alum who's recently been a finalist for the National Book Award, well, that's actually not ever happened to us until now. So we're not really sure what we're supposed to do, but I think we're doing okay. We've had a nice visit so far. Deborah spent the morning with a big combined class, and we talked about writing and memory, and keto, I think, was in there at some point somewhere. And that was interesting. And we got this now, and Deborah's asked us to take her out for a big old pizza tonight. So we're going to do that. So we better get this started. But before I go, I just want to say one more thank you. And that's to you, Deborah. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being a part of this. We are proud of you and so happy for you. And this success that you're having couldn't happen to a more worthy and deserving writer. So thank you for being here. And I will turn it over now to my colleague and partner in the creative writing program, Elizabeth Hoover, and she'll introduce y'all to Deborah.
Hello, everyone. It's my distinct honor to introduce Deborah Jackson Taffa. Her full bio is on all the posters. So instead of going through all of her accomplishments, I know there are lots of creative writing students in the audience, and I wanted to talk a little bit about how, as a writer myself, I learned from Deborah's book. The book Whiskey Tender was one of my teachers over this summer, guiding me through a particularly difficult writing project that involves confronting and ultimately trying to reconcile my privileged life with my stated but often unacted upon beliefs. I read Whiskey Tender mostly in Chicago, where my mother moved after spending close to 50 years in the same house in a neighborhood in Pittsburgh. And I felt oddly unmoored, even though I hadn't lived in that house for over 25 years. I wasn't sure what I was trying to say or how to find my way into the subject I was trying to tackle. But then I read in Taffa's book how her name Jackson came from her Yuma ancestors refusing to sign over their land to white settlers. The federal government signed on their behalf with the last names of US presidents. The house I grew up in is in the Mexican War Streets neighborhood of Pittsburgh. I grew up one block from a street called Jacksonia, named after Andrew Jackson. And my childhood neighborhood was, because it was developed shortly after the so-called Mexican-American War, many of the streets are named after battles and generals. I realized the history that ran under my childhood home was a thread connecting us, though how the stitches reveal themselves, where they dip unseen under the fabric, how they tangle and knot is markedly different. The red, white, and blue celebrations of that colonial violence in my neighborhood, this is so embarrassing, inspired me to name my pet rabbit Zachary Taylor, who was a war hero because of his relentless violence against Indigenous people. At the same time, I was reading James Baldwin's The Price of the Ticket. And in it, he writes about the grim emptiness of the white world. This is also whiskey tender, the false trades and empty promises that have secured my place here at this podium on the unceded land of the nations of the Osage, Miami, and Kickapoo, among others. And I don't know how much longer my own soul can survive or the nation can survive trying to live off this grim emptiness. But how to proceed as a person who understands the world just because I write about it. And so Taffa's book has become both an inspiration and guide. She writes, to be born to a people with no written history can feel like a kind of cultural amnesia. I had to choose my own path. Then the breadcrumbs, I had to choose my own path when the breadcrumbs leading home had been eaten. I wish I had understood what a privilege it is to have the freedom to choose, to mold your own fate, to choose your own values, and carve your own monsters and gods. As a reader, it is my privilege to witness her molding in this extraordinary work of research, history, philosophy, theory, and storytelling. And as a writer, it is my privilege to take this book as a masterclass on how to excavate the unwritten past. Though the reasons for our respective cultures' historical amnesia are very different, Taffa has shown me how to do this work with love, empathy, honesty, and rage, which, as this book has taught me, is often synonymous with love. Taffa makes me want to not just be a better writer, but a better daughter, a better sister, a better aunt, a better community member by thinking of my history not a burden or a shame-induced paralytic, but as a call to responsibility. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Taffa.
My gosh, what a beautiful full circle moment for me. I see Sheila in the audience, Murray, and the reader series is named after David Clewell, with whom I studied and spent so much time in my years here at Webster. It's very meaningful for me to be here today, and I'm grateful for it. Thank you. I think one thing that my bio does not tell you that I would just briefly mention is that when I left Farmington, which was a small city in northwestern New Mexico, that was known as the Selma, Alabama of the Southwest in the 1970s, I thought that I was so wounded by the educational system that I would never get a degree. I had completely disidentified with the goal of a college degree or going to a master's program. I went and studied with medicine people. I studied with a Cheyenne medicine man named Eugene Black Bear, who I'm thinking of today. I studied with some Dene medicine people, and I traveled internationally in Indonesia and West Africa. And it took me a very long time. I was in my mid-30s by the time I realized that to enter the world of publishing requires a team, and that I would have to learn to trust other intellectuals, academics, agents, editors, that I couldn't walk around the world with this anger that prevented me from assembling a group of people that all wanted to push my vision forward. And finding that sense of trust with gatekeepers is difficult. And the place where I took that first step was here at Webster. And I will never forget the team of professors that I had here, the multicultural literature class that I took with Sheila, the things that Carla Armbruster taught me about overcoming oppression and how to empower myself, and the poetry and fiction and nonfiction workshops that I took with Kathleen Finneran and Murray Farish and Steve Lattimore, and of course, David Clewell. I'm just so joyful to be here. And the cardinal rule of any reading, and I remind my students of this all the time, is not to go beyond time. So I'm looking at my phone, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a fragmented introduction to the book that very simply kind of lets you see both the styles in which I am writing and the vantage point from which I'm writing, which I would say was a much quainter version of America, a time when my parents believed very much that this country was a meritocracy, and all we had to do was work very hard and we could become the president of the United States. It seems very quaint now to me looking back, but it was a simpler period, the 70s and the 80s, I think, in many ways. And I've tried to capture its spirit in this book. Animus, 1981. The highway to Silverton, Colorado is an ear-popping ascent with hairpin turns and missing guardrails. Dad hugged the mountainside with the van as we climbed, tapping his horn before each blind curve to warn truckers of our presence. We had left the hellish reservation border town we just moved to behind and were headed to a vacation paradise located past a ski resort named Purgatory. As soon as Dad pulled into our favorite camping spot on the Animas River, I jumped out of the van and ran down to the water. At the age of 12, I was still knobby-kneed and tube-socked, my brown skin splattered with mud. How lucky it felt to be a kid, unhindered by a woman's body. My bones remained hollow and birdy that summer, boyish and inconsequential for a few more blissful months. Tell me your favorite childhood memory, and I'll tell you who you are. I remember the laughter my sisters and I shared as we tossed tiny balls of bread to see-through fish along the shoreline. I remember Dad fiddling with the worms he used for bait, and Mom asking a kayaker about a rapid called mandatory thrashing. I remember all of us working together to pitch the tent and make a temporary home. Our time on the river felt like spiritual repair. Dad grilled the trout we'd caught during the day. He whittled long marshmallow sticks, and we sat around the fire listening to his reservation ghost stories. The fog wall that rose one night when his buddies chanted Indian songs. The mountain lion girl that scared him as a kid. Dad burned with energy, and long after the moon rose in the sky, he kept talking. We'd go to bed exhausted, knowing that in the morning he would heat our shoes by the fire he stoked at sunrise. Nostalgia plays tricks on memory, and the Animas River is consistently sepia-tinted in my mind. Dad was always my hero anyway, so when I remember him at the river, I remember his bonfire stories, or the way he used to let us touch the dent in his skull where he got shot by his brother's arrow. I don't stop to think about his anger or his strict rules or how often he was gone. I don't dwell on his workaholic ways or consider the overbearing weight he and Mom placed on us to excel. Remembering the river helps me forget, at least for a moment, the challenges, fears, and feelings of inadequacy I experienced in my childhood, my own set of rose-colored glasses. A trick of the mind that helps me highlight the peaceful days, the quiet ones that punctuated the violence, pressures, and confusion of being a native girl in a northwestern New Mexico town where cowboys still hated Indians. 3 white teenagers had murdered 3 native men just before my family and I moved there for my father's new job when I was 6 years old. Navajo people marched in the streets that April, and though we missed the protest and backlash, the town's tension remained consistent, even after the Civil Rights Commission came in to keep the peace. My early childhood took place in an era when good Native families did not move off the reservation because close friends and relatives called relocation a betrayal. It was a time of conflicting choices when young people like my father and his siblings, who grew up on the reservation, faced a dilemma that pitted high reservation unemployment and double-digit inflation against the desire to belong to their tribe. In moving from our Quetzon Yuma reservation in California to the Navajo reservation in New Mexico, my father chose to be an individual, and my parents decided they wanted their kids to be mainstream Americans, passing down an implicit appreciation of social climbing, along with and in conflict with the realization that our people are excluded, ironically, from the central mythologies of the American identity. I want to say ours is the iconic American story, but that would insult our non-native allies, the decent folk for whom the consequences of broken treaties and forced assimilation are already a burden, and for whom oppression may also be an inheritance. I don't tell this story to create a divide. I tell it because there are too many dark corners in America that can be relieved of persistent shadows by shining a little light. I tell it because our story belongs to all Americans, some of whom may be surprised by our history. I tell it to celebrate our survival as a culture, as well as the hope, strength, and grace of my family. 2. Almost Human, 1972. We sisters were broken girls. We twisted our ankles sailing off playground swings, toppled out of tamarisk trees, plucked yellow jacket stingers and broken glass out of our skin. We slammed our fingers in car doors, burned our feet in campfires, and then sat in the waiting room at the Yuma Indian Hospital, ice pressed to injuries. Joan broke her wrist. I broke my collarbone. Lori had a 2-inch scar down the center of her chest. Monica slipped through the handrails of a tall metal slide and landed 20 feet below. The reservation was rowdy in the 1970s. By the time I was 3, scars were a main source of pride. Put a little whiskey in Dad's beer, and he got to talking about his friends. Crushed under a fast-moving train, stabbed in the chest during an alley fight, propped against a tree at a public park with a hot needle sticking out of an arm, killed in a landmine explosion in Vietnam. Mom tried to shush Dad when he told us his stories, but he said we needed to know the truth if we were going to survive, to hear how tough the world could be. Swagger was a sure way for us kids to get praise. Despondency hung over the reservation, and when toddlers and children acted rebellious, adults saw hope and verve. A sassy girl was a girl who might make it, even against the odds. My sisters and I did what we could to impress. We rejected all things girly. We painted our dolls' faces with markers, tattooing their chins in the style of our female ancestors. We chopped off their hair, and when they grew grotesque, threw their heads in the trash can and danced their bodies around, calling out like barkers selling tickets to see Geronimo at the World's Fair. Come and see the amazing headless wonders. We were unruly Indian girls, not the friendly Thanksgiving Day types who knew how to cook and behave. Our mother said it was too late to teach us any manners. Dad always said, broken bones grow back stronger, raising us the same way his older brother, Gene, raised him. A father's job was to control the pace of the world's wounding, to dole out the pain in slightly bigger doses over time, so that his kids would learn not to break under pressure. This is what I think of when I think of my sisters and me growing up. We didn't get anything for free, and we blossomed because of it. Blood flowering into bruises, skin thick and ripened under the Sonoran desert sun. 3. The Price is Right. This is 1973. When my parents left their wedding reception, Mom was sober. Dad, of course, drove. He sped toward 4th Avenue, the main thoroughfare in Yuma, cutting into the opposite lane on corners, fishtailing with a groom's finesse. Mom grew scared. She hiked up her wedding dress, reached her long leg over his thigh, and stomped the brake with her high heel shoe. The tires locked up. The car swung wide to the right before spinning them all the way around to the left, showing them the surprised expressions of people in other cars. It was like we were riding on the tilt-a-whirl at the Yuma County Fair, Mom said. The car slammed into the side of a busy downtown bar. The Plymouth's front end was mangled. Steam poured out of the radiator. It was a Sunday afternoon in April 1963, and the day was still light. Afternoon drinkers came flowing out of the bar's smoky interior like rice throwers out of a cathedral in a haze of incense and prayer. Being the eldest of 15 kids had made Mom conspicuous in this small town, and the bar was her father Juan's favorite. So some of the regulars and barflies realized she was a Herrera girl and wanted to know if she was okay. Sirens started up in the distance. A couple of biker chicks helped Mom out of the car, and she stood with them on the sidewalk in front, staring at the damaged headlight and hood. In her hurry to get out, she'd caught the train of her wedding dress in the door, and it had ripped. When she saw the torn fabric, she started crying. She told us, "I could see your dad through the window of the car with his forehead rested on the wheel, and I knew exactly what he was thinking." Dad was from the Yuma Reservation across the train tracks and river, and he was worried the town cops were going to book him again. But when the cops pulled up at the accident scene and looked at Mom, plopped on the curb in a puff of white satin, mascara running down her cheeks, they decided to be merciful and let Dad go. Mom said they felt sorry for her because she was a good local Catholic girl who'd married a crazy Indian. When Dad walked in the front door and heard her telling us the story, he laughed and said she was wrong. He said the cops let him go, not because they pitied her, but because Mom was beautiful and pretty people got away with shit. He pulled off his black boots and lifted his holy socks onto the coffee table. He put his arm around her and said getting away scot-free on their wedding day was the first sign Mom's charm would work magic in his life, like a lucky rabbit's foot or a powerful tattoo. He reminded Mom how romantic he'd been at their wedding, how he'd refused to let her sisters decorate the car with do-it-yourself flowers because the phony tissue paper looked too common for a woman of her caliber. Instead, he and his brothers had performed a top secret midnight operation, sneaking into St. Thomas Indian Mission's garden on the reservation, where they cut a bunch of roses to string over the roof of the car. Mom groaned, "Don't brag about stealing from the church." But the two of them laughed, and Dad went in the kitchen to grab a snack. Mom's protestations never fooled me. She loved the memory of the stolen roses, as well as Dad's claim that her beauty swayed the cops. But what made her light up especially was the way he called her his lucky charm. This is how my parents twisted bad things around, seeing the appearances of events in funhouse mirrors, stretching memories tall and pretty when they were really goofy and squat. They knew a story could be told in various ways, and this is how they chose to shape theirs, and how they would teach me to shape mine as well, by molding their wedding day car accident into their first blessing as a couple. And this is from A Phantom Limb, which is 1975. The canyons of Grandma Esther's homeland in New Mexico contain Pueblo healing plants alongside toxic waste. The village where she grew up, Powati in Laguna Pueblo, sits along the Grants mineral belt, where a Navajo man named Patricio Martinez was hired by the railroad and the Anaconda Mining Company as a uranium scout in the late 1940s. He discovered high-grade ore in 1950, after which a yellow cake mining boom took place in western New Mexico that lasted 30 years and led to 60% of US uranium being taken from the region. In 1952, Anaconda Mining Company opened the Jack Pile Mine 10 miles south of our family's village. There, 3 open pit uranium mines, some of the largest in the world, remained operable until 1982. Yet when Grandma Esther contracted cancer, no one talked about the possibility of environmental causes for her illness. No one mentioned the poison that bled into the mountain runoff, gathering in the groundwater of wells in the region, affecting Navajo, Hopi, and Laguna Pueblo alike. No one noted how roads and houses were sometimes built with ore and rock from the mines. And no one brought up the atomic bomb that Grandma Esther saw tested when she was at Laguna Pueblo in 1945. And the last little section I will read from is from 1984, and it's called Pocahontas. The cheerleaders said they called Josie Lumpy because they liked her. A wild Apache girl with a crooked grin and braided hair, she'd been a little on the heavy side as a kid, but by our freshman year of high school, she'd picked up a meth habit and lost most of the fat. We were at the same party that night at Jay's house in the foothills by the community college. His parents were out of town, an art gallery opening for their friend, and my half Korean pal Kira had invited me to join in. Like Jay, Kira had been born in New York City, and I loved being in her orbit. It made it easier to imagine getting out of Farmington. Josie had been invited to the party to sell weed, and I knew as soon as she swapped the skunk in her pocket for cash, she'd disappear. She disdained most kids at our high school, the popular crowd, the smart ones, the shy Navajo girls who stuck to each other like glue in the lunchroom. She was irreverent and moody, and the longer I knew her, the more her wildness felt traditional to me. The month before, a rumor had torn through the school, a story about Josie going ballistic one night when she caught some skinny white boy rolling a drunk Navajo downtown. People said she'd broken a bottle and sent him running, threatening to spank his veins good. In my book, the story made her a hero, but the jocks, cheerleaders, and self-identifying mods at the party cared less about the reason she did it and more about how dangerous it made her seem. After I heard the story, I started to feel drawn to her, just like I'd been to Uncle Gene. She started that rumor herself, Kira told me, before walking out on the patio to smoke with Jay. I watched them light cigarettes through the window, knowing they'd talk about Motown, jazz, ska, and London-based bands unfamiliar to me. Afraid to sound stupid, I stayed inside and nursed a lukewarm beer until Josie came over to me. "What's she doing here?" she said, shouting over the music, making sure everyone could hear. Josie called me Pocahontas El Malinche Tokmatone, a traitor by friendship and blood. All she could see was my half-breed body. She hated me because my mother was a Spanish siren with a leopard skin jacket and almond eyes, a prima donna who refused to be called indigena. It didn't matter that I felt repulsed and betrayed by mom's thinking. She could smell the Lopez Herrera lineage on me. It was in my pale winter skin, my private school vocabulary, and my enunciated way of talking. To Josie and the other badass Native girls at my public school, I was mainstream enough to be considered white. Maybe they thought my family had too much money, or I acted too confident around our teachers. But regardless of what they thought, that my mother canceled out my father, I also knew the one drop rule was real, and that to most people in Farmington, I would always be Indian. Thank you.
So we can do some questions now. So wait for us to come around with the microphone so that we can get your sound on the Zoom broadcast. Okay, who would like to start?
Hi, Deborah. So it's been about a
Oh
decade
my
since
gosh, I
you've
know.
seen there yet. So in your book, you mention a lot of dreams and Ikema, and I was really curious as to the rhetoric of the word and whether it's like a pan-indigenous type of vocabulary or if it's just related to the Yuma tribe,
Yeah.
et cetera, and more about how it has inspired the fableness within the memoir,
Uh-huh.
because fables are true to people, and
Yeah.
so how did that relate from the Ikema to the fables and then to the curation of
Uh-huh.
your book?
Yeah. So it is specific to the Quetzal Yuma people. And I was telling the classroom that I visited this morning, I really think a lot about how Australia's first people also have a concept of the dreamland and perhaps the impact of living in a desert where there are, you're out in the sand rolling and it's emptiness, might contribute to such a philosophy. When I first started writing the book, I was very intent on recording all the differences between the Quetzal people and what we think of as other Native American tribes that are perhaps more in the public eye. So a lot of people, when they think of Indigenous people, they think of braids, or they might think of like the yarn bun that Navajo people wear, or like Princess Leia has those big donut things on the sides of her head that are Hopi. And George Lucas went to the Hopi reservation and saw the young women wearing their hair like that and fashioned it for Princess Leia. Well, in the Quetzal tribe, we had dreadlocks, and people are like, whoa, I didn't know that Native American people had dreadlocks. So I was operating kind of from this idea that our tribe has never been written about. There was never a book written by a Quetzal Yuma person before me. And so I wanted to introduce people to the particular philosophies and the hair and the clothing and the way we met our demise in the gold rush. When people came through crossing to go into California, they came through our land and trampled our crops because that's where the river kind of narrowed enough for them to cross with their cattle and their wagons. Um, it was only when the book was nearly finished, and I looked at that section where I go to the dentist when I'm little, and I get my teeth pulled, and I feel my grandma with me, and there's something really magical that happens, I think, at that juncture in the book, that I realized what was missing, and it was the embodiment of the Ikema as a tribal belief system. So ironically, the very last thing that I wrote before the book, I called it done. Everything was finished. It was all done. And my editor was like, I think it's finished. And I told her, I think I need to write these 4 italicized sections that represent powerful dreams that I have had. And I'm going to splice them into the book to create an embodiment of the tribal philosophy versus just teaching about it. And I wrote them in the air because I was flying back and forth to Hawaii a lot to see my daughter. I think I had some quick flights. I just got on the airplane and wrote one, and then I flew back and I wrote the other, and then I had to go back the next month and I wrote one and I wrote the other, and then I just sliced them in. So they weren't even written while my feet were on the ground, which is kind of a weird thing about it. But yeah, that's kind of the story of the way those came about.
So I have a question, maybe on behalf of my class. So we noted that you come back to your grandmother at the end and her habit of reciting the place names of the place that she was born and I guess raised and then left. In the other books we've read, we've also noticed a really strong emphasis on the role of grandmothers. And of course, you're now a grandmother. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about your grandmother and the choice to sort of end the book with her. Or it's near the end anyway.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. Yeah, I have to speak to my culture and my people, I guess, with that by saying that Native women, they have really held it together. I mean, in problematic moments in our history, there's a grandma at the house who is making sure that the kids are fed and that is taking everybody in. And, someone comes from down the street and they don't have anything. She shares flour with them and makes sure that they have something to make bread or a pie or whatever. I mean, the women are the strength of the family. And because I had this problematic relationship with my own mother, who, later in my life, when I was living in Yuma as an adult, I lived on the reservation from the age of 27 to around 30 with my husband and my kids, and he was working at the casino. And I would go pick up my mom's mother, Mary Herrera was her name, and I was getting WIC milk and eggs. It's like a governmental program that helps you when you're under income have things for your kids. And we always had too much milk, so I would take it to my grandma Herrera because she had, she had 15 kids and she lived a life of poverty. And we were in the car at some point. She asked to go to the post office after I dropped off the milk, and I got angry with her because she always belittled my father's native heritage. Like she thought Hispanic people were better. And that was when she admitted to me that she had indigenous bloodlines and that she had been ashamed of them. And now, of course, I know that a lot of New Mexicans have indigenous bloodlines when they're Spanish. They have bloodlines Azteca or Yaqui, or, because we were conquered from the South, the bloodlines are all intermixed. But there's this horrific thing where Hispanic people oftentimes want to act like they came straight from Spain and to deny their indigenous. And that happened in my own family. And so my mother was hard for me to hang on to. My grandmother became this presence that was such a solid, she had such a solid knowledge about who she was. She spoke Keres Pueblo, the Pueblo language fluently. She was 100% Laguna Pueblo, where her husband was half Quetzan and half Shoshone Paiute, because Indian boarding schools created this era of intermarriage. When you become intersectional in your identity, and I know my own kids are going through this as well, you have so many versions of yourself and so many ancestral lineages to kind of look towards, you can feel ungrounded in your identity. And my grandma was just this beacon, this rock, and she was very gentle. Losing her was one of the hardest, most kind of, it had a huge impact on my life. I think it would have been a different life if she had decided to go through chemotherapy. But her indigenous belief system taught her that death is a natural outcome of life. And when she got cancer, she said, it's time for me to leave this world. And by leaving, I'll make space for someone to come into it. And everybody protested and everyone was upset. And then in the end, everyone said we should just respect her. And so we watched her. She didn't take pain meds or anything. She just eventually, she left. She was gone. There was no other way to end the book for me. Also because I think a lot of indigenous kids feel like if they leave their ancestral homeland, they have somehow defaulted on their identity and they can no longer be indigenous. And I find that to be a very destructive belief system. And I think that indigenous values are very portable. Here in Missouri, I discovered the Current River and it became my home. It was a place I could go to stand by and to feel that it was a sacred place. It's beautiful. There's one everywhere you go. You just seek it out and find that numinous spot and you're good. You have your value system with you wherever you go.
Hi. Could you talk a little bit about working with editors, agents on such a personal story and such like a living story and about relationships that you still maintain?
Yeah, for the writers out there, I always say, you only get one debut. Your second book is your second book, So I know a lot of people that feel pressured to say, I've done it, as if they have to prove that they could do it. And that was not the approach that I wanted to take. I always said, well, this book is about people that I cared, I care deeply about the people that I'm exposing in this book. And ethically, what makes it correct for me to expose the fact that my father went to prison as a minor, or that my grandmother and mother were embarrassed of their indigenous love line, or their bloodlines, or any of it. You know what I mean? It's like, and so over time you grapple with the material and ask yourself why you're doing what you're doing. What is your intent? It can't just be about money and it can't just be about fame. Do you know what I mean? No one, in other words, can tell you when your project is done. You have to have an inner beacon that says, This is as far as I can push it. This is where it's gone and it's correct. And the point of telling the audience that I'm writing to is finally correct. And by knowing who I'm writing it for, I know what to cut and I know what to include. I know the order of information. I know why. You know what I mean? So my suggestion about gathering an agent and a team of editors and working with the gatekeepers is you want to feel yourself on very solid ground before you enter into those relationships. Otherwise, you're always going to be afraid that they might manipulate the meaning of the book. They might tell you how to shape it. They might tell you what's commercially viable. They might try to bend you in directions that don't feel correct to you. Now, if you're working on a project that's fiction, that's great. If you're working on something that's nonfiction and you're putting all your people over the fire, it's maybe less so, you know? Once you have assembled your team and the project feels like it's sturdy enough that you're ready to invite them in, then the biggest advice I give to students is you have to learn to trust the people that you have on your team. Pick them carefully, and once you have them, trust them. They're not telling you things are wrong with your manuscript because they're trying to be mean. They're helping you. They're an excellent set of outside eyes. You know what I mean? And running up against criticism and finding people that are poking holes in your rationale, they're the greatest gift that you can have. And when you have people who are positioned to share in the profits of your sale, you have to believe that they're doing what's right, or they, you know, they're on your team. For me, it was really hard to trust people. And so that's why I always emphasize that with other people, because sometimes it's scary to trust someone that you haven't known very long. So choose wisely. And once they're on your side, really believe that they're on your side.
So I was wondering, how much, if at all, did you talk with your family, like your parents and siblings, while you were writing your memoir?
So when I lived on the reservation in my late 20s, my grandfather's sisters were still alive. And one of them had just decided that she was going to stop doing dialysis. So I'm not saying lightly at all, you know, when I make the statement that we knew they were reaching that time period when they were going to be passing. And so I went to their houses a lot when my kids were toddlers, and I sat on the porch with them and I listened to them. Sometimes I just sat with them and held their hand and we didn't even talk. But the strength of their presence and knowing, you know, was really important. I knew that I had my dad and my mom and my sisters for longer. So it wasn't until I got to Iowa City for my MFA that my mom and dad flew out and there was a radio lab there. And so they came into Radio Lab and we just sat down across from each other with microphones and we talked and I asked questions. I asked about men that had died at the power plant where my dad worked. I asked about how many times he was sent away and what happened when he was fighting forest fires. Like I recorded 24 hours maybe of audio on with those interviews. And then I transcribed them all into messy, messy pages and documents of stuff. And when I was writing, when I needed facts, I would go in and grab that and look at it. And if what I was seeking or looking for was not in the transcriptions, I would call my father and I would ask him. And sometimes his memories were a little bit vague, like if he was a little kid and they went to go get their first four-walled house when he was a little kid. His dad and his grandpa put him in a truck. They went somewhere in California, dismantled a house, brought it back. Before that, he had lived in like an army tent and he didn't have shoes, you know, when he was a little boy. And I was able to find that in books in the library. So the Arizona Historical Society and a lot of hard research at the very end of the project filled in the family lore with like a clear factual account. My sisters, one time I went to them and I was like, remember our dog had 12 puppies? And they were like, no. My oldest sister was like, that dog had like 7 puppies. And my other sister was like 4. And we were all fighting. And it really dawned on me that you can grow up with sisters and feel very close. And when you look back at a memory, everybody has a different version of the thing. And it's daunting because if you try to write a book based on like public opinion, your subjective viewpoint and voice will be totally destroyed. So I wrote the book you know, you enter a contract as a reader, as a nonfiction author. You're telling people, I'm going to get as close as I can to what I believe is the truth. Hard truths, not the stupid little quotidian truths, but the actual hard truths of our existence. And that is something that I pledged to do for you. So when the book went into, I kept telling my dad, read the book, read it. And he was like, I don't want to read it yet. I don't want to read it yet. 2 months before it was published, it was already in galley form being reviewed by newspapers. He told me, okay, I'll read it. And so I sent it to him. And he only took like 3 days, and he called me, and I was like all nervous. And he said, you got us. And I was like, he was like, you really got us to a T. And I was like, I must have got something wrong. He was like, little things. You really, really got us. And so that was, you know, he's 83 years old. And so for me, that was, and I think my oldest sister called him and was mad about her portrayal as like a conservative. And he told her she's telling the truth, and I don't want to hear it. You can't say anything to her. And to this day, my oldest sister hasn't said anything to me. Maybe you'll see a picture of me with a black eye on Instagram and you'll know she caught up to me finally, but so far so good.
One of the things that touched me in your book was the prejudice you suffered as, I think, as a high school student and so forth. Has that changed in the last whatever years since that time? Is it still happening?
That's an interesting question. You know, we have been neighbors out west for a very long time. And where I'm living now in Santa Fe, it's like the first UNESCO city for literature and arts. So it's like a blue dot, like a super blue dot. It's like living in New York City or San Francisco. So I don't experience it there. The weird thing about racism and prejudice is that you never know when it's going to jump out of you. So you don't walk around the world thinking of yourself as a member of a race or an ethnic group. You're just you. So you're not thinking about racism all the time. And then you're on a flight and someone's really rude to you. And then you realize, oh my gosh, they see me through this lens of race. And it's surprising. That's what's so wounding about it, you know? But I make sure that I tell my kids, actually, here at Webster, I was so attempting to understand this part of us that kind of judges other people and has conflict with other people based on appearances, that I took this course called the psychology of oppression or something like that. And our professor had us watch this film, and in the film it's very foggy, and you feel like you're walking down the sidewalk and it's dark, and out of the fog begins to emerge the shape of a person walking towards you. And then the video pauses and it says, who might you see coming out of the fog that would make you cross the street out of fear? And then it asks you, who might you see coming out of the fog that would immediately relax you? And then the professor told us, the interesting thing is, the person that makes one of us feel safe is the same person that makes another person feel afraid, and vice versa. And the idea was to impress upon us that our amygdala makes snap judgments about people based on appearances, and that it's only in pausing and giving our frontal lobe a moment to kind of acknowledge that that assumption might be wrong, that we move beyond our prejudices, but that prejudices are universal, right? And so other examples of it that we used in the class were, you're walking in the mall and you see a set of elder people, maybe in their 70s, walking, and you immediately think of them as a group that might fall down, and so you veer away. Or you see little kids ready to cross the street, they're like 4 years old, and you think they're going to run into the road, so you slow. So you're basically generalizing about populations. Your amygdala does for survival. I guess I say that by means of saying that we all have prejudices, right? And so I try to remember that when I encounter people that say stupid things, which I have a lot this last year as I've stood in front of so many audiences. I try to be generous. Oh, maybe this will be.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oh, no, this is a new person.
Rejects.
One thing that I noticed from reading excerpts of the book was that it seemed like your dad was always very intentional. Or at least that's I feel like the way it was presented is like his actions, reactions, lack thereof was all sort of like to teach and like impart wisdom. Um, as a parent yourself, how much do you feel like that's a part of your own conscious process when you're parenting, and how much of it do you think is just that was sort of like the nature of who he is, to be a storyteller, to be a
That's
teacher?
such an interesting question. I was listening to an Ezra Klein podcast the other day, and they were talking about the decline of paternalism in parenting. Like, we don't think that we know more than our kids now. Like, it's become fashionable to think I'm not the one who should teach my kids. I should listen to my kids and try to, you know what I mean? But I think my father had this very solid idea that he had been through a lot, that he was lucky to have survived a very difficult childhood, and that it was his job to help us navigate the world. Now, he got very busy with his overtime, and he was really intent on pushing my generation ahead, and he made a ton of sacrifices, but he never failed to listen. And sometimes I think that that's it. And at the end of the day, like, the ability to hear where people are coming from, to listen and really care about what they're saying before you think about what you're going to respond, is what creates the sort of version of wisdom that you see in my dad. But that portrayal, so many people across the country have been like, I fell in love with your dad, and your father is so, I wish I had had a father like your dad. And I'm always like, he's wonderful. I don't know what else to say about him. You know, here's an example. He's 83, he'll be 84 this year. And my mother died, and he was really lonely because it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And he's always looking for ways to engage and reinvent himself. And so he decided, like 4 semesters ago, that he was going to go to college. So he takes one class a semester with Donna Otham Community College, which is a tribal college that allows him to study online. He's currently taking a class in poetry, which he has found very challenging. He's like, I don't, half the time they ask me what this poem is about, and I'm like, I have no idea. He's like, it's all young women in the class, and I don't know what's going on. But he'll send me poems and like, here, can you look at this and edit it? And I'll read it and I give him feedback. And last semester he took Apache history. So his idea of life never stopping, you don't arrive, but you continue to learn and to listen for a lifetime, is a huge part of who he is. And I went to him one time complaining about my oldest son, and I said, well, Julian says that, you know, that everyone wants us to listen to our elders, but what if our elders don't know? And I thought my dad would be outraged, and he was like, well, he's right. Some older people don't know, and you should not listen to them. Age is not necessarily synonymous with wisdom. So he just comes out with stuff that he says, you know, that is always so, I don't know. He's really great. He's a great guy.
So when no one had a question, I did think of something, but oh, I know. So Deborah, I'm sure they've asked you this in some of your interviews, but who are some of the writers who have most influenced you?
Yeah, well, you know a lot of the writers that we read. Now, I think I mention her in the book because I have to. Leslie Marmon Silko's book, Ceremony, was earth shaking for me. I don't know. I could read that book a million times, and it is just, I admire it so much. And the poetry of people like Simon Ortiz and Joy Harjo, of course, means a lot to me. When I was a child, and it sounds like a cliche, but it's totally true, I read Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and it was like, it was the moment when I realized that nonfiction writing doesn't only highlight history, but it can create history and it can change viewpoints. And the fact that she had the audacity and the courage to not hide behind fiction, for me, was just, you know, it was really, really important. That was a very big moment. In recent, I loved Memorial Drive by Natasha Trethewey, for the little italicized poetic lyric sections, which kind of gave me the idea for the 4 italicized sections. We talked about Arundhati Roy and the God of Small Things. I don't know, there's so many authors that I could name. I love South American literature. I've really enjoyed reading a lot of Russian literature. I like short stories. I'm not going to be able to think of everyone now, but just read widely if you are attempting to write. You know, I know Tobias Wolff and Mary Carr are huge influences. The Washington Post compared my voice and my humor to Mary Carr, and I thought, that's it. I could die happy. That's the last review I ever read in my life. I'm just going to frame it on my wall and move ahead. And you know, I'm really pinching myself because I'm like, this is not bad for some little kid who grew up on the res and like had all these problems as a child. And I'm very much trying to take it all in stride because I think as writers and artists, it's very important to never get the sense that you have arrived and that you are like there. That there is always beyond the horizon. Otherwise, you will not be comfortable with having the beginner mind to work on your next project. Every time I sit down, even if it's just a short essay, I struggle with what is the structure? What is it that this is supposed to be about? Okay, I write it down, then I cross it. Okay, but what is this really about? And then what is this? You know, you keep trying to drop down because we have so much cognitive dissonance that it's hard for us to see ourselves clearly. And particularly when you're creating a persona for yourself on the page, you're constantly mining the gap between who you think you are and who you actually are beyond the nice things that you try to believe about yourself. You know, you're always looking for ways that you're culpable and involved in the problems that haunt you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Let's have a hand for Deborah. Snacks that are out in the lobby. There are books for sale in the lobby. Deborah will be posting up in there to sign books for you momentarily. So please stick around and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.